The flood, the world's biggest natural killer. A destroyer of all it touches. Water gives us life, but it can also be deadly. The flood, a terrifying power on our raging planet. The Guadalupe River, Texas, just after a wall of water smashed down the valley.
How many are there of you?
There's about 40.
How many?
40 in the box.
The river suddenly rose 22 feet after a thunderstorm, and a busload of school children was caught in a flash flood. Tragically, 10 of the children were lost.
Michelle, were you stuck in a tree?
Yeah.
How long were you in there, sweetheart?
About an hour.
About an hour? What was going through your mind right then?
Scared. Terrified because I can't swim.
We prayed a lot and sang, just talked.
There are two main kinds of flood. Flash floods are sudden, unexpected torrents. They tear down rivers and smash into pieces anything they encounter. Flash floods are catastrophic and deadly. The other type are the big, slow floods that rise over a long period of time. There's usually plenty of warning. As more and more rain falls, the water rises and floods gradually engulf the land. These big, slow floods happen in every country in the world. Eventually, rivers break through their banks and levees. Roads are swamped, crops are ruined, commerce comes to a halt. In America, every year water kills on average 138 people, most in flash floods. This one hit near Las Vegas in 1990. It caught Murray Brown's Jeep and swept it downstream, with him trapped inside. For the rescue workers, it was a race against time. And it was a race they seemed to be losing. It wasn't just Murray Brown's life that was at risk, but the lives of the rescue workers themselves. Astonishingly, even after 20 minutes trapped underwater, Murray Brown managed to survive. One life was pulled back from nature's violent grip. Most are not so lucky. The danger from flash floods comes from their suddenness and the lack of warning. Athens, Greece, January 12, 1997. In one evening, 2 inches of rain fell in 3 hours. Hundreds of homes, businesses, and shops were flooded. Central Athens was without power for several hours. An underpass flooded, totally covering a car. The diver went down to check for the driver. By next morning, they had pumped the underpass dry. Mercifully, there was nobody in the car. The driver had escaped in time. But in Corinth, 50 miles west, the result was more sudden and more devastating. A flash flood. In these floods, 3 people died. The pattern is always the same. Sudden heavy rain that quickly runs off the land and flows into narrow channels. This is South Africa on Christmas Day, 1995. Torrential rains had filled 2 rivers to their bursting point. The flood struck just 20 minutes later. More than 700 homes were washed away. The helicopters called in to evacuate those trapped were only able to carry out corpses. That Christmas afternoon, more than 130 people were drowned. Nearby, a minibus was washed off a bridge, taking 15 more people. Another 4 were lost when their car was swept off a road. 1996 had arrived with tragedy. Another year of floods had begun. On Wednesday, the 8th of August, 1996, it was Spain's turn. A tourist recorded the start of the flood through the window of his caravan. Minutes later, a wall of water and mud, some said it was 12 feet high, smashed down onto the campsite. The victims were in shock, completely dazed by the force of what had hit them. The mud swamped cars and trailers, dragging them a mile down the hill. But not all floods are so violent or so deadly. There is the other type, the big, slow floods that build up over a long time. This one flooded parts of Andalusia, also in Spain, at Christmas 1996. After a week of heavy rains, the water slowly rose. Eventually, the rivers overran their banks and flooded 25,000 acres of land. Since these big floods are slower than flash floods, they're more predictable and safer. Nevertheless, in this flood, 4 people died. They can also cause huge economic damage. This one destroyed over $1 million in crops. Just 2 weeks after the floods in Spain, this one overran parts of Northern California. The land was so waterlogged by heavy rains, the soil could no longer absorb it, and the floods began to build. Vineyards were drowned, houses swamped, transportation paralyzed. The damage across California was estimated at $2 billion. And this flood was brief. Not all of them are. In China, big floods are common, but their scale can be staggering. In this one in Jiangsu province, 2 million people had to be evacuated. Over 500,000 civilians joined 9.5 million peasant farmers in the rescue work. But despite their every effort, the floods grew beyond their control. Finally, the army used explosives to create huge drainage paths. And the floodwaters drained into the Huangpu River. Big floods are usually caused by events that occurred weeks, even months before. In the winter of '96-97, blizzards in North Dakota dumped twice as much snow as normal. Two months later, in April, there was a sudden thaw. The Red River overflowed, and the cities along its bank were flooded. In Grand Forks, the flood produced one extraordinary effect: fire, caused by shorts in electrical circuits. They had to call in the air tankers to get it under control. There are other, rarer kinds of floods that follow in the wake of typhoons, cyclones, and hurricanes that can be killers. These were caused by rain from a typhoon in Japan in early July 1995. Big storms can dump immense quantities of rain. In 1911, one storm in the Philippines produced 46 inches. Inevitably, the waters flood the land. Yet some floods defy categorization. This is Iceland, a barren land of glaciers and volcanic craters locked in ice. Here in 1996, there was a massive flood. A flood caused not by rain, but by fire. On September 30th, the Laki volcano, buried under almost half a mile of ice at the center of the glacier, erupted. Far below the surface, it melted the ice. An immense lake formed under the glacier. Everybody knew there would be a flood, but the depth of the ice, combined with the volcano's unpredictability, meant no one knew where or when it would emerge, or how violent it might be. Eventually, 7 days later, it found its way through 30 miles of underground tunnels to the glacier's edge. When it came, its power was overwhelming. It ripped out from under the ice sheet with tremendous force. Southeast Iceland is only thinly populated, and they had plenty of warning. So fortunately, nobody was hurt. But the flood left scars on the land and wrecked every man-made structure it encountered. The most dangerous flood is one that is not expected. One of the worst happened in Italy on the morning of Wednesday, the 19th of June, 1996. It started to rain heavily on the mountains north of Pisa. Everywhere, water was flowing down the sides of the valley, rushing to the river below. The villages in the valley bottoms began to prepare for the worst. As the rain continued, the hillsides began to give way. There were rock and earth slides. The roads started to break up. Conditions became ever worse until the road was all but impassable. This is the village square of Stazzema, about 3/4 of the way up the mountain. The stream here normally runs quietly under the bridge, its water crystal clear. Downstream and 1,000 feet below, in the town of Saravezza, the water was also beginning to rise. Very soon, the river was 12 feet above its normal level. Within a couple of hours, it was carrying millions of gallons of excess water at terrifying speed. People watched, mesmerized by the fury of the deluge. Up the mountains at Stazzema, the river could no longer hold the flow, and the flood burst free. The cameraman who shot this video could only watch helplessly. His own car was one of those washed away by the flood. Bottom of the mountain in Saravezza, the river had become an uncontrollable torrent. Hidden beneath these these racy waters were some of the victims. One body was found nearly 20 miles from where it must have entered the water. The entire flood was caused by one storm that in 14 hours dumped 2 inches of rain on an area of 100 square miles. Every drop of that storm's water was channeled into one riverbed just 40 feet across. The outcome was inevitable. At the height of the rescue effort, 15 helicopters were operating from a soccer field on the plains below. It was the only way to reach the mountain villages, because most of the road had been swept away. The stories the casualties told were terrifying. At the top of the valley, the floodwaters had been up to 30 feet high. They had ripped away entire buildings. The people were horrified. Everyone knew someone who was missing. The Italian military coordinated the rescue operation, working from a school next door to the soccer field. But despite the incredibly rapid emergency response, 14 people died in the flood. The army was able to get relief supplies to some of the lower villages on foot. Ironically, after the flood, it was drinking water that the villagers needed the most. The roads higher up the mountain were completely destroyed, so 12 helicopters were still needed to take emergency supplies and services to the isolated villages. As they flew up the valley over the lower villages, the scale of what had happened became stunningly clear. This is Cardoso, the highest and most devastated of the dozen villages in the flood's path. 200 people had to be evacuated from here. The village street had totally disappeared under rocks and rubble. Everything had to be brought in by helicopter, including sniffer dogs to help find bodies. The helicopters also brought back some villagers. They searched through the wreckage to recover what they could of their possessions. Even at first glance, the damage seemed appalling, but it was actually far worse than it appeared. Much of the village was simply buried. This is 30 feet above what once was street level. These are the top floors of a 3-story house buried by the debris. More people died in this village than any other. Some were probably even entombed beneath the rescuers' feet. Those who survived the flood were faced with a grim and almost impossible job of rebuilding their lives and their homes. "600 people were homeless. 250 houses were destroyed. Many villagers never returned after being helicoptered out.
Spies, they're too...
There are parts of the world where floods give life, not take it. Where floods are actually needed to survive. In India, there are just 2 seasons. 8 months of dry, followed by 4 months of very wet. Cool, wet air from the ocean collides with the hot land, and vast rain clouds form. This is the engine of the largest weather phenomenon on our planet. The monsoon rains start in the south and move north. It takes more than a month to travel all the way up India, saturating the land and bringing celebration and euphoria to the people. The land once again becomes green. The rice can grow. The wells fill with water. But to the crowded streets of Calcutta, the monsoon brings disease and death, as well as new life. Every year, the drainage system is overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water and breaks down. But without the monsoon, there would be famine and death on an incalculable scale. For the monsoon floods bring life to the fields, and the rice will be harvested before the land dries back to dust. The timetable of life is driven by the arrival and departure of the monsoon. The monsoon's path is ultimately blocked by the mighty peaks of the Himalayas. High in the mountainous region just south of the Himalayas lies Cherrapunji, the wettest place in the world. Each year, the average is 33 feet of rain. But in a wet year, 75 feet rains down. For comparison, Washington State gets about 10 feet every year. Every year, the monsoon inundates huge tracts of Asia. In 1988, 3/4 of Bangladesh was underwater. The monsoon has helped form civilizations across half our planet. The life of these people depends on it. The annual cycle of flood and drought is a way of life and of death. Each year, the floods kill hundreds, sometimes thousands. Yet they also green the land, giving life for another year. Yet despite adapting to life with the flood, the pressure of a growing population is forcing Bangladesh to try to reclaim at least some of its land. They're building levees in an attempt to contain stretches of the vast Brahmaputra and Ganges rivers. They must move millions of tons of earth, turned to mud by the very floods they hope to prevent. They do it by hand. Machine technology is simply unaffordable. Even if they were given a high-tech, Western-style reinforced levee system, they could not afford to maintain it. And anyway, even high-tech systems can fail. And when they do, it can be devastating. In the Great Mississippi Flood of 1993, 50,000 homes were destroyed and 48 people died. That summer, the rainfall was 2 to 3 times more than normal. By early July, the Mississippi had spread to 7 miles, the Missouri to 20. In Kansas City, a riverboat broke its moorings. It only stopped when it hit the 3rd bridge. At sunrise, these homes were dry and safe. By sunset, they were 6 feet underwater. The National Guard brought in portable pontoons. In 1 hour, they built a potentially life-saving 130-foot-long floating bridge. At Quincy, Illinois, the flood destroyed a gas station, and somehow the fuel ignited. Amazingly, no one was injured. Everywhere, the levees failed. In South St. Louis, the River Des Peres rose over its defenses. City workers tried to plug the hole.
It's me. I mean, it's relentless. It just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. Once that water starts flowing through, you don't have a lot of time to close it up. We started digging away at the side of that hill and just started throwing dirt in here just to slow down the water. Quite frankly, there are times when, I look at Gary and, I shrugged my shoulders and shook my head, and we looked at each other, but then another truck pulled up and we just kept at it.
It had been a close call, but they won. Pigs climbed onto farm roofs. The water had risen for 23 successive days. At St. Louis, the Mississippi was 5 feet higher than ever before. The St. Louis airport was under 8 feet of water. Sunday morning, all is quiet. At 9:15, the levee just behind the farm fails. Within 11 minutes, water from the Mississippi is rushing through the farm. Within 70 minutes, the farm is gone. Of all the levees, over 3/4 failed in some way. The floods of '93 caused $20 billion in damage. They were the second costliest weather event in America's history. Only Hurricane Andrew caused more damage. But the emotional cost was beyond reckoning. John and his wife Elaine took their first trip back to their flooded house.
You can look through the house. The walls are gone.
Oh my God, it is. Looks like a tornado went through there.
What can you see?
I don't see anything. It's like everything's gone. I know. I guess you're only given what you can take. But after a while, you get to where you can't take anymore.
Every year, floods destroy, injure, and kill. Yet they're nothing more than water, something we usually think of as soft, gentle, life-giving. But water is powerful. It carved the vast and beautiful contours of the Grand Canyon. Most of our planet has been shaped by the slow, gentle, persistent effects of water. Streams gradually wear away the rock. Over millions of years, they create new landscapes. All that water needs is time. It has, quite literally, shaped our world.
Johnstown, Pennsylvania, seen in 1889 of the worst flood ever recorded, is submerged.
And over the years, floods have also left their mark in human tragedy. The newsreels have recorded many terrible disasters.
Heavy rains caused the Conemaugh River to overflow, and an all-encompassing rush of water inundated the countryside. Now watch sheer terror, such as you've never seen before. Rumors of a dam break drive thousands of people on a mad rush for higher ground. Purposeless is this panic as the dam holds and the flood subsides.
Floods happen almost every year in America. In March 1997, it was the Ohio River's turn. Here, the flood was forecast, prepared for, and for the most part, controlled.
But it really became apparent here by Saturday morning that we were going to have an excessive rainfall event across the Ohio Valley, the heaviest rains being near Louisville and also near Falmouth, Kentucky, and was reaching the Cincinnati area probably in the order of 2, 3, 4 in the morning.
The forecasters had known for a month that conditions were right for flooding. Now on Saturday, March 13th, it happened. A belt of violent storms traveled right along the line of the river. All the water they produced was caught in the same river basin. The forecasters could only watch as the water level began to rise.
I'm actually placing a call right now to look at the current Cincinnati River gauge data. Basically, we're calling right into the river gauge. Normally, we have it set up to look at it once an hour automatically. But, you know, when the river's changing quickly, we can look at it at any time, and that's what I'm doing right now. I want to look at it as it stands right now.
In 48 hours, the Ohio River had risen 28 feet. The Ohio is familiar with floods, and as a result, is extremely well prepared. Along each side of the river are great levees. But the banks flooded, and the river continued to rise.
We wound up by Monday figuring it was going to be probably a Wednesday evening crest, and at about 64.5 feet, and in reality it crested at around 64.7 feet Wednesday evening at about 7 p.m.
So the forecasters gave 3 days warning. They got the timing and the height almost exactly right. Accurate forecasting is important because it can affect the fate of the riverside town.
Boat 76, we're clear about the only thing we can do is notify EPA. I don't think there's anything anybody can do at this time.
This is New Richmond, just a few miles upriver from Cincinnati. Here there are no levees. Thanks to the forecast, the inhabitants of the town were evacuated before the flood struck. A few whose houses were above the forecast flood risk were able to stay.
Pulled up on a house, heard a bunch of kittens meowing and inside the house, so we stuck our head in a little tiny hole that was at top, and what I saw were two large cats and a box full of kittens that were forced to the roof by the water.
Hey, yeah, I know.
The floods at New Richmond lasted days. This is Falmouth, Kentucky. It's on the Licking River, the Ohio tributary where the heaviest rain fell. Here the flood was far worse. 90% of the population had to be evacuated, many of them in the middle of Saturday night. The water rose so suddenly that it was almost a flash flood. It got to 24 feet above flood level in just a few hours. The water left a ruined landscape of wreckage and river sludge. Before anyone could be allowed back, the Army had to check for damage and for bodies.
The only people that are authorized to be in the area is emergency personnel, the fire department, the police, people like that. And we're not letting anybody come in and check their houses because they haven't gone through to make sure that they're structurally safe yet.
Every house had to be carefully searched. The task was immense. It was 4 days before the people were allowed back to their homes. While the Army surveyed the devastation left by the flood, the refugees could only wait anxiously and hope they could recover at least something from the ruins. For this couple, that meant trying to salvage what they could from the waterlogged remains of their grandmother's house. Every house in Falmouth had the same story to tell of devastation and destruction. In this one small town, 4 people died. And the flood affected dozens of towns. Its overall cost was about $300 million. It was the worst flood here for 30 years. 22 people died. Such tragedies are repeated around the world year after year. In 1997, it was Poland's turn for disaster. The waters began to rise in mid-July and simply did not stop. This was probably a 1,000-year flood. That means it was so severe that you could expect one this bad just once in 1,000 years. It engulfed huge tracts of land. At its height, 2,000 square miles of Poland was underwater. And the floods also extended into Austria, Germany, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. In the confusion spread over the 4 countries, it was difficult to know just how many people had died. Reports put the figures at 60 in Poland and 48 in the Czech Republic. $80 helicopters and 45,000 troops helped with the rescue effort. disasters have always been inevitable on our planet, but they may become more powerful and more frequent as global warming begins to bite. Most scientists are now convinced that if the climate is changing, weather patterns around the world will be disturbed. Floods may become more common, more savage, more unpredictable than ever before. The future cost in tragedy and death is impossible to estimate. Scenes such as these will become a little more familiar every year as floods rip across our land. Around the world, sea levels will rise. In Bangladesh, the most threatened country on Earth, 90% of the country is less than 30 feet above sea level. More and more lives will be devastated by the flooding waters of our raging planet.